Senator Scott Bryan is a Liberal from Victoria. He joins us now. Good morning, Senator.
Morning, Chris.
Joe Hockey is announcing this serious financial crime task force. How much of a problem is it for the budget tax evasion, illegal tax evasion and legal tax avoidance?
Well, it's important, Chris, firstly, that you do mention the distinction between the two. One is a legal, one is a policy issue that sometimes needs to be addressed. As I understand this announcement from the Treasurer, it actually follows up from the successful work of Project Wickenby, which does conclude at the end of this year. And so there are resources being directed towards tracking down illegal activity and ensuring that our tax system remains robust and the laws are appropriately enforced.
And tax avoidance, that is the legal avoidance of paying tax?
Well, that's more a policy issue, Chris. I mean, if people are obeying the law, they do need to be treated differently from people who are being alleged to have broken the law. There's a very different issue at stake there. The Taxation Commissioner has substantial anti-avoidance powers, the so-called Part 4A provisions of the Act, that in layman's terms allow the Tax Commissioner to deem an activity for the primary purpose of avoiding tax and therefore to capture it in the tax system. But the debate that's been happening in the community recently has been much more about legal activity. And so that's a policy issue, not a legal enforcement issue.
Now, Labor and the unions are saying, look, the government needs to make sure it's getting all the revenue it's entitled to. This is the wrong time to be cutting jobs out of the Australian Tax Office because those people are needed to address evasion and avoidance.
Well, again, I think we need to distinguish here between legal and illegal activity, conscious that the Taxation Commissioner has powers to deem certain activity to be tax avoidance and therefore captured. But the point is that there were a number of job cuts announced under the previous government and a number under this government. The Taxation Commissioner has indicated that he has the resources and he has the tools that he needs to maintain the integrity of our tax system and ensure laws are being complied with.
Some of these tax avoidance schemes are very complex. It's difficult to know just looking at the surface of them whether they're tax avoidance or whether they actually trip over the line into illegality. Can the government be confident that it's collecting enough, all the revenue it should be?
Well, I'd say that point also applies to those making somewhat hysterical claims about how the budget can be balanced by virtue of going after Apple or Google. International tax arrangements are, by their nature, very complex. Transfer pricing arrangements within multinational corporations are, by their nature, very complex. We have companies that are the beneficiary of those, as well as there being some issues that the Treasurer has highlighted that he'd like addressed through the G20. These issues will really only be addressed through coordinated international action. But I am confident, and the government is confident, that while we do direct resources to maintain the integrity of the system, that the Australian taxation system has maintained its integrity. What's been debated publicly have been policy issues, and I'd respectfully suggest to some of my Senate colleagues on that committee that there have been somewhat hysterical attention-grabbing claims as part of a bidding war between the Labor Party and the Greens as to who can prove to be the toughest on multinationals.
You say there that there are some Australian companies that are the beneficiaries of international tax laws. Is that a good thing?
Well, I think we just have to be conscious that we have in certain sectors resources and even a company like CSL, true multinationals and leaders in their field. So this is why the Treasurer has said we need to have considered coordinated action and not knee-jerk reaction being proposed by Labor and the Greens as part of their bidding war, because it could have inadvertent consequences on Australian-owned companies and their Australian shareholders and indeed revenue collected in Australia.
But if a company like CSL had to pay more tax, would that be a bad thing?
Well, there's always a cost to higher taxes. I mean, every tax review ever undertaken that I have seen, right, including the Ken Henry review, including paper released recently, indicates that higher company taxes lead to lower investment, lower productivity, lower economic growth, and even lower wages. So we have to be very conscious that we can't continually increase the burden of tax without negatively impacting the households, families and job opportunities that every Australian has. But more importantly, I mean, this is being used as a diversion by Labor and the Greens, who do not want to address the deficit challenge their government left Australia with. We are spending more and more each year We had record spending growth under the Labor and Greens government, and that is what has driven the budget into deficit.
But certainly one of the tests here has to be fairness. Surely it's unfair if a big multinational company, whether it's Google or Apple or an Australian company like CSL, is paying significantly less tax than say, a domestic company.
Fairness is a judgment issue, and that's a policy issue. When we're looking at enforcement of our tax law, we look at what's legal. If we want to have a debate around the levels of tax, that's appropriately a matter for politicians. I think there's a legitimate fairness issue too here in our income tax system, in that you have 2% of taxpayers paying 26% of all income tax, and nearly half of taxpayers after transfer payments not paying net income tax. I mean, a fairness issue goes both ways. It also goes to how much can we tax people.
Okay, moving on, the renewable energy target. Labor and the coalition government are quite close, but still there's no agreement. Now businesses are starting to call for a compromise. Their argument seems to be that the figures being put forward by the two sides of politics are now kind of close enough, and that certainty is more important than whatever the final figure is. Labor said it can wear 33,000 gigawatts an hour. Is it time to close this argument down, to reach some sort of compromise as desired by most of the big business groups?
Well, ideally, certainty is a key objective. But certainty is not the sole objective. It has to be a reasonable target. Now, this is well outside my portfolio area, so I'm not across the incredible detail that the renewable energy target involves. It's good to see that Labor has moved after remaining intransigent for several months, and as I understand it, and the Prime Minister alluded to, discussions are ongoing.
Okay, and just finally on asylum seekers and stopping boats, Bill Shorten addressed this issue yesterday to some degree, and he said if we have to place people on unsafe boats and they drown at sea, well, I'm not going to be party to that. That's being interpreted as more or less some sort of loose endorsement of established policy by the government. Do you think that there's not much difference left on the approaches to asylum seekers?
Look, a speech and addressing a heckler or two at the McKell Institute isn't policy and isn't a substitute for policy achievement. The Labor Party refuses to acknowledge the importance of turnbacks where safe to do so. It refuses to support temporary protection visas, and just as was the case under the Howard regime, before an election, in the middle of a parliamentary term, they'll try and sound like they believe in our policies, but as soon as they get into government, they unwind them. We saw the disaster of that under the Rudd and Gillard governments. Despite all the rhetoric, it took this government to solve the problem. And critical to that were turnbacks, where it was safe to do so, and temporary protection visas. And Labor will not sign up to that. And if they ever get back in control of this policy area, they will unwind the successful policies for the second time and recreate the problems we had over the last few years.
Okay, Senator Scott Ryan, thanks for your time today.
Thanks, Chris.